two or three things were at play here. Number one, we were very diehard, devoted American combatants. You know, we were warriors, and so it was pretty tough to change our minds. And the other part was they were very unsophisticated when it came to basic psychology. And so they tried to brainwash us the way they were brainwashing their own people. And they could do it pretty well. They'd have these big speakers that would blare out the party line. And in fact, they moved us around to different camps and different cells. And before we'd get rice and water, they would put a speaker in our cell because they thought that if they could blare the party line on a daily basis to us, that we would come around and see their point of view and their way of life. And in fact, their president, Ho Chi Minh, said from the very beginning that he was going to take all the American prisoners and re-educate us and send us back to America as good communists. And that's what he was trying to do. But he was doing it in such a way that was actually so simplistic and even humorous. We'd get a big laugh lots of times out of their attempt to brainwash us with these phenomenal kinds of things. I mean, out of sight kind of stuff that they would come up with.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Awesome Wholesaler Experience Podcast, where we look into the many facets of the job, the career, and the lifestyle of investment and insurance product wholesaling. I'm your host, the creator of the Awesome Wholesaler Experience, and yours truly, Awesome Mike. Hey everyone, today is a very special episode for me. Many of you know that I have some time in the military, and I was introduced to the guest today, that this fellow, and I had to jump on the opportunity to schedule him and let you meet him. Let me just dig right into his biography. Captain Charlie Plumb. I almost said retired and plumbed together, sir. That's what it sounds like. Captain Charlie Plumb has lived what he believes to be the American dream. As a farm kid from Kansas, he fantasized about airplanes, although he felt certain that he would never have the opportunity to pilot one. It would be the United States Navy who afforded Plum the opportunity to live out that dream. Now, after graduating from the Naval Academy, Plum completed Navy flight training and reported to Miramar Naval Station in San Diego, where he flew the first adversarial flights in development of what would now be called the Navy, what would be called the Navy Fighter Weapons School, which, ladies and gentlemen, is currently known as, Top Gun. That's right. Take that, Tom Cruise. You should give Captain Plum some kudos. Maybe he has over the years. You know, the next year, Plum Squadron, the Aardvarks, launched on the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk with Fighter Squadron 114 to fly the Navy's hottest airplane, the F-4 Phantom jet. Now, Captain Plum's code name is Plumber, of course. Charlie flew 74 successful combat missions over North Vietnam and made over 100 carrier landings. Let me read that again, folks. Flew 74 successful combat missions over North Vietnam and made over 100 carrier landings. Now, on his 75th mission, just 5 days before the end of his tour, Plum was shot down over Hanoi, taken prisoner, tortured, and spent the next 2,103 days in an 8-by-8-foot cell as a prisoner of war. During his nearly 6 years of captivity, Plum distinguished himself as a pro in underground communications. He was a great inspiration to all of the other POWs, and he served as their chaplain even for 2 years. Following his repatriation, Plum continued his Navy flying career in the reserve squadrons, where he flew A-4 Skyhawks, A-7 Corsairs, and F-18 Hornets. His last two commands as a naval reservist were on the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea and at a fighter wing in California. Very cool. He retired from the United States Navy after 28 years of service, and his decorations include Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts, Air Medals, Presidential Unit Citations, POW Medals, Vietnam Service Medal, Republic of Vietnam Campaign Medal with 1960s device, and of course a Combat Action Ribbon. Since his return home, Plum has captivated more than 5,000 audiences in almost every industry around the world with stories that parallel his POW experience with the challenges of everyday life. To this day, Captain Plum continues to fly left seat at every opportunity. In fact, Bill Backrack revels in the time that he spends with you in the air, Captain Plum. The most treasured plane that Captain Plum owns and flies is the World War II PT-19 open cockpit antique, which is currently on loan to the Commemorative Air Force Museum in Camarillo, California. He also owns a Rutan-designed experimental single-engine Long Ease. I hope I said that correctly. Captain Plum autobiography, I'm No Hero, is in its 35th printing. That's the one that I have. Captain Plum has appeared on Larry King Live, Nightline, and several other network TV and radio stations. His 4th of July speech is in the Congressional Record. Captain Plum was awarded the top 10 speakers in America by Meetings Magazine. And in 2010, Captain Plum was inducted into the National Speakers Association, CPAE Speaker Hall of Fame. And finally, Captain Plum, you have reached the summit by being a guest on my humble little show today. Thank you so much for coming on board. How are you today, sir?
Thank you. Awesome. I have reached the summit here, right along with you. You and I are at the pinnacle. There's just no place to go from here.
That's a great way to look at life. If you can celebrate every day, and you're going to tell us a lot about this as being the summit, even if it's in that day, that's a great way to live, a great attitude. I have to ask you a question, though.
In your intro, you said, that I feel like I lived the American dream. And as a farm kid from Kansas, I still live the American dream. I have a wonderful life. I am, I travel the country. I'm married to a wonderful lady and 4 kids and 3 grandkids. And it's just, couldn't be better. I don't know how I would write a better script for a life than the one that I'm living.
Well, that's wonderful. And you're a bright example of what's possible to a lot of young Americans and us middle-aged Americans, let's call it. Before we get too far into your story, though, Captain Plum, I'd like to ask you a question. And as I was doing my research and really learning all about you, this kind of came to me. And a lot of the people that are on the line today or that are viewing in, they're traveling salespeople on the road, staying at different hotels. And I just thought about it. I said, given the conditions at the property and all of the incredible atrocities that you suffered during your 6-year stay at the Hilton in Hanoi, North Vietnam, I have to imagine that you probably are a Marriott guy now, aren't you?
I am. That's very true. But, it was kind of interesting because when we first came home, one of the first things we did was go to the White House. And the president invited all of us and our first ladies because a lot of us came home to divorces. And so I took my mother to the White House. And Conrad Hilton actually opened up the Washington Hilton Hotel for us to stay while we were visiting the White House.
He knew your business was vulnerable.
Exactly.
Bill Marriott.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know if it's positive or negative advertising, to have the Hanoi Hilton, but there is actually a Hanoi Hilton now.
Wow.
In downtown Hanoi.
That is very interesting. I'd like to start off and introduce your history to the audience and talk a little bit about, how you became, Charlie Plumb. I know that you grew up in Kansas, and to kind of fast forward, you had a couple of inspiring coaches that I really felt like they dropped some gold into you. The first one was Coach Clancy Smith, a doughboy, World War I veteran. You mentioned he still had shrapnel in his leg. And he said something to you, which I've heard before, so I'm sure that he probably heard it as well. But it was something to the effect of, after a losing season. In fact, could you tell us the story? I think you know the one I'm referring to.
Sure. This is grade school basketball, and it was in a very small town in Kansas. And so we played other small town teams, and we were just ragtag. We didn't have uniforms or anything special at all. And but we were competitive and we wanted to win, but we didn't have a very good team. And try as hard as he Coach Smith just, couldn't bring out a winning team in the last game, which would be the last team he'd ever coach. We wanted to win for the coach, and we didn't. And so sauntering out to the locker room, here's one, 13-year-old lad, and the coach comes up from behind, and he still had shrapnel in one leg, so he limped, but he still caught up with me. And I felt his arm over my sweaty shoulder, and I looked at the coach. It kind of, and I guess my head was down and my shoulders were rounded, and I said, "Sorry, coach, I guess this team's just a bunch of losers." He did not accept that. And he squeezed my shoulder and sunk his fingers into the flesh and said something he didn't want me to forget. And he said, "Son, whether you think you're a loser or whether you think you're a winner, you're right." And I've heard it said before in different ways as well. And so it wasn't really original, I suppose, to the coach, but it sure was that day to me. And I asked him about it the next day at school. I said, I'm not sure exactly what that meant, coach. And he said, "Look, in 4 or 5 years, you're going to come back to me and you're going to be in high school and you're going to drop out because the teachers picked on you and nobody was your friend and you couldn't, you couldn't take the pressure. And then you're going to come back to me in 10 years telling me that you married this lady and she turned off bad and you had to divorce her, but she was the reason you failed." He said the difference between success and failure in your life is not the things around you. It's the choices you make about the things around you. And you can choose to be a winner, you can choose to be a loser, and you can choose to give away that choice. So, and that, that was very meaningful through the rest of my life, and still is today, as a matter of fact. The whole idea, and I think that's one of the big challenges that we have in our society today. Everybody is ready to point fingers at everybody else and never really take the responsibility for their own actions or anything else. And sure, you can't control the inputs to your life, but you can certainly control the way you respond to those inputs.
Yeah, Coach Smith, you had an opportunity to plant that seed into your fertile mind. It's an interesting dynamic that a coach or a leader or a mentor has on a child with that fertile mind, as opposed to someone who's got a few layers of cement buried in there. And your high school coach, Bob Johnson, he was well, you can tell us about this too, but he was a pilot and very influential to you as well. Tell us about how Bob Johnson influenced you and maybe how it got you into all this mess in the first place.
He had been a Navy pilot in World War II. And so he would tell us stories, about the aircraft carriers and landing on aircraft carriers. And so I was fascinated, by this guy, and primarily how humble he was, because, he'd been a combat pilot and and now he's a coach. And I suppose he was an inspiration to me, just to know that, hey, if he could do this, maybe I could too. And he encouraged me to follow my dreams and try to make them a reality. Now, at the time, as you said in the introduction, I'd never ridden in an airplane and didn't know that I'd ever be able to ride in an airplane. And so it was way out of context for I'd never been out of the 4 states of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, never seen the ocean. And the whole idea that I would ever even be able to ride in an airplane was pie in the sky. And he told me that I could, and I'll never forget Bob Johnson. He later became principal. He went from coach to principal of that school. And so when I got my wings, my Navy wings, this is 5 years later, I went, and the first thing I did was walk in his office in uniform with my wings on. And the poor guy started to cry just to see me all winged up. So, I suppose that we don't know, you and I really don't know the people we touch, because I was never able to go back and tell Coach Smith, thanks. Now Johnson lived for a long time, and so I, continued to communicate with him. But the people we touch, and then the folks that they touch because we touched them, I mean, it's an enormous responsibility you and I have, you know, and sometimes kind of scary to me because you don't know how you're going to affect these people. You know, sometimes in my speeches, I will have people come up to me afterwards and quote something that I didn't really say, but something that they needed to hear at the time. I was speaking to a bunch of investment bankers in Tucson, Arizona. This has been many years ago. This is when AIDS was first coming about and people started understanding what AIDS was. And the ballroom cleared, and I could tell kind of out of the corner of my eye, somebody was waiting to talk to me, and it happens fairly frequently. And it was so with just this guy and me in the ballroom, and he's got tears in his eyes, and he said, Captain Plum, you really got to me in that message. And he said, I've got to tell you something only my doctors and my lawyers know. He said, I have AIDS, and I'm terminal. He said, and just as you talked about waking up every morning, hoping that would be the day that the Marines would break down the gates and you'd be set free. He said, every morning I get up and go to the newspaper and hope that there's a cure to my disease. Well, I had recorded that presentation. I went back to my hotel room and I replayed that thing because I was confident that I had never said anything about waking up in the morning, Marines breaking down the gate, me being set free. But that's what he needed to hear at that moment in time. And so, you know, sometimes even as good as we think we are and as effective a communicator we can be, and this is certainly true, you know, in sales and wholesaling, and you know, and certainly in your FAs, you just really never know how you're going to touch that prospective client. And so, yeah, I mean, you do the best you can, but sometimes there's no way to measure it.
You know, it's interesting. They do say, and I'm sure you've heard this stat before, that only 7% of the message we communicate are the words we use.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it is all of the. So you might have actually said that without actually saying it, and that fellow for sure was looking to hear that.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Congratulations with that. And excuse me for that. Let's talk about, so you come home, you got your wings, you toss them on Coach Johnson or Principal Johnson's desk, and you kind of transitioned there, and then you went off to Miramar because you were waiting to get assigned to your carrier. And you had a little fun here. This sounds like a terrific time. I've had the occasion to play the opposition force in my military career, and it is some of the best times shooting your buddies up.
Yep.
Especially when it's only practice. Can you tell us about Miramar and how you made Tom Cruise so famous?
Well, Paul Krukey and I had been together through flight training, and we were good buds. And we got out to Miramar and found that we had a 6-month wait. The good news was we'd been assigned the hottest airplane in the world, the F-4 Phantom jet. I mean, this is twice the speed of sound, 1,400 miles an hour. It really is mind-boggling. But the bad news was we had a 6-month wait because there was a pool of students waiting to go through this replacement air group, the RAG. So Paul and I wandered down the flight line and found this hangar down there full of F-9 Cougars. Well, we had flown F-9s in the training command, so we were checked out in this airplane. They were using this airplane as an instrument training machine where they were 2-seaters, and so the student would sit in the back under a hood. You had a hood to blank out anything you can see. You couldn't see anything at all. All you had was instruments. And so the whole idea was the instructors in the front and students in the back under the hood. And then you simulated flying through the Super. And so we signed on, we can do this. We can sit in the front seat and the guy in the back seat. Well, but it was very boring. You're just droning along, and making these approaches and never more than a 30 degrees angle of bank. And anyway, that's kind of what it was, an instrument. And we'd save a few hundred pounds of fuel, and we would lurk off the coast of San Diego and wait for the Phantoms to come through, the hot airplane coming through there. and they would take off the runway there at Miramar, and about they got over the coast in about 10 or 15 miles, we would start out high and we were light. They were low and they were heavy, and we could turn inside them. And so we just had a ball. We'd show up in our Snoopy goggles and our white scarves and high fives and whatever we did at that time. And it was really a lot of fun until one day we came back to the radio room. On the bulletin board it says, Plum and Krukey report to the commanding officer of the F-4 Squadron immediately. Well, we thought we were toast. So here's two guys in sweaty flight suits. We'd just come off of this mission, where we had been the adversarial guy, and we just killed the opposition. And we're pounding on the door of the commanding officer of the F-4 Squadron. And so he said, come in. We opened the door, and here is this guy, old guy. He must have been at least 35. He was over the hill, and he's got glasses on, and he looks over the top of his glasses at us. Now he's in a sweaty flight suit too, okay, which should have been our first indicator. He said, you the two guys out there in the F9s chasing around the Phantoms? Yes, sir, we were. We're braced up. And did you follow a Phantom through an entire loop? Yes, sir, we certainly did. He said, did you have your gun sights on that Phantom the entire time? We said, yes, sir, we did. He said, you know who was in that Phantom?
Wow.
He said, I just got back from Vietnam. He said, we're getting killed over there. Our kill ratio is terrible. He said, and you guys looked an awful lot like MiGs back there when you were on my tail. He said, you want to go do that again tomorrow? And so for the next several months, Paul Krukey and I showed up. We had to go early because the F-4 is such a fast airplane, and the F-9s were fairly slow. But we'd launch about 30 minutes and get out to 80 or 100 miles off the coast and turn back in and have these head-on fights, with the F-4s. Now, the problem, of course, was the F-4 was never designed as a dog-fighting airplane. In a Cold War, we thought we needed to fly high and fast and shoot the missiles and kill the Russian bears and make a very slow turn back to the carrier. Then we got in this war where we were using Korean War and World War II tactics, and the airplane and the pilots were not ready for that. And that's how Top Gun got started, and it worked. From those days, then they made a syllabus within the replacement air group. It was just, part of the training. And then a few years later, it transitioned into its own entity, its own squadron, its own Navy fighter weapons school, the Top Gun. So that's how it all began.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was reading that and learning that, they've mimicked that in the movie, multiple scenes.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that. And it's I've actually done something similar with on one of the sales teams that I was on, and under the montage or the mantra that iron sharpens iron.
Mm-hmm.
And so we put together a little bit of a round robin of peers, and we called it Iron Night, to where you go up and you present in front of your peers, and they play OP4, and it's a great way to to perfect your skills and sharpen your swords. So you finish up there, you have your time, and then you get assigned and you go in country. And how long was your tour supposed to be? I mean, you did 100 landings on a carrier, you did 75 missions. How long is a tour, or was it back then?
It depended on the schedules of the aircraft carriers and how many carriers you had. So, but we were expected to be gone for 9 months.
Okay.
And then another carrier would come over and relieve us on station, and we'd go home.
Gotcha.
And so it was. But of course, as you well know, in a combat situation, there's lots of changes, and so. But my flight, the 19th of May, 1967, was just 5 days before we were scheduled to leave the line. And we all knew that.
Yeah.
And that may have been one of the problems. Statistically, the last few days that a soldier's on, in the field or pilots in the air, the last few days before you're going home, you get, I don't know, you get a little complacent, and I could actually see that, and looking back on it after many years, kind of wonder if that complacency might have added to my getting shut down.
Yeah, I spent several years in the military, and we called it short timers attitude. I think that probably a similar concept.
Yep.
One of my platoon leaders, platoon sergeant, excuse me, he'd slap me if I called him a platoon leader. He actually rotated me out. I was the base gunner in a mortar platoon, and once I got within my 6-month window, he rotated me out to a support position because he knew that my attitude would change, and if we got deployed, he didn't want me, having that attitude or leaving out. So he was wise in that regard. My father and father-in-law both spent time in rice paddies in Vietnam.
Oh, really?
Yeah, father-in-law was in the air wing. He was a maintenance guy in the Marine Corps, and being a colonel's driver, and got to shine a couple seats with his posterior. But he flew door gunner on quite a few missions. And my father was 11 Bravo, drafted Army in the rice paddy when you were there. He spent the Christmas of '68 in Da Nang, and so it was kind of interesting to read your story and to be able to reflect. They're both still alive and healthy and Army as ever. So
tell them thanks for their service. We used to support those guys when we couldn't get up north. We'd fly down south, and it was some of the toughest flying I ever did because we knew we had to get close to be effective, but not too close, start to singe their mustache, and so it really was very sensitive missions that we were on when we were doing close air support for the Marines and the Army.
Yeah, that's a great. I get chills thinking about that as being a soldier and reminiscing.
But boy, were they happy! Especially when we'd bring in napalm. They loved nape.
Yeah, they made movies out of that too. One of your, I guess your bodies of work or your calling has been to gain more exposure for the POW, for the POW movement. You wrote an article back in. I think it was published on LinkedIn back in the fall of last year. In fact, on September 21st, which is POW Day, 18 exactly. But essentially, it's the third Friday of September.
Right.
So I don't know if anyone else knows that, but listeners, if you want to celebrate an honorable holiday, POW Day, the third Friday of September each year, it's a great way to pay tribute, to our nation's prisoners of war that sometimes maybe gave the most in our defense and our way of life. So I'd like to read this quickly, this article that you wrote. And it was about your return to Vietnam, to Hanoi. And one of the most impactful things is you say that the often repeated cry of Americans that were hoping for your return, for the POW's return, was POWs never have a nice day. Someone says, have a nice day. You think POWs never have a nice day. On this day, though, on our nation's POW day, you said that your current mantra is ex-POWs never have a bad day. And it's all about our freedom. That's a remarkable paradigm shift. And I appreciate you for saying that. And I'll quickly summarize this here. You went back to Vietnam after 42 years ago when you left as a POW, and then in a park in the middle of Hanoi, a woman approached you. You could see that she was about your age, and she had a black bag slung over her shoulder. Want to buy a postcard? She asked you in very good English. She was on crutches, missing her entire right leg. I told her I'd buy a postcard and asked if she'd tell you her story. I'm trying to go first person, third person here. I'll just read the article. We sat down on a park bench. How did you lose your leg? I asked. She answered, linebacker 2. I was surprised that she used the secret code word for the massive B-2 bombings B-2 bombings that forced the North Vietnamese to the peace table. She said that she was 15 years old. And then you asked her, you said, I commented that she spoke excellent English, and why wasn't she employed as an interpreter or museum guide in the city? She responded, my government would never give me a permit to do that. They don't want to cripple representing Vietnam. And at that moment, that reality struck me that two very similar individuals scarred by the same war were living such different lives. I fly 2 airplanes, have 2 boats, and a life of luxury, and she ekes out a meager living selling postcards in a park. And the difference is the environment. In my country, I have the opportunity to achieve my dreams, and hers, she is in prison as restrictive as the Hanoi Hilton. On this POW day, I'm thankful to have served in a nation which continues to give me the freedom to live the life that I choose. Captain Plum, that's awesome. Appreciate you writing that, and that is inspiring not only to me, but I think to everyone. Can you take us back a little bit and tell us about your experience as a POW? And I kind of want to guide the walk through it. It's very interesting. What I noticed as I was reading about your stay, sir, is that you kept cracking jokes and making light of the situation, making fun of the situation. And I tried to think back. I was never taken prisoner and never, faced the atrocities. But for some reason, we seemed like the fun wasn't as vigorous as what you, and you had this in the face of these such serious situation. You kept making the jokes. You were teasing these peasant children. Okay, they had captured you, and they had put the sack over your head and were dragging you through and picking at you. And you could see these kids though, and you said that you would tease them. You'd slump forward, and then you would jerk back towards them, and they would gasp. Can you tell us, how did you keep such a good sense of humor and be playful in such a time of crisis?
It became fairly evident early on that we had a choice, just like my coach said. We could cry about a situation, or we could chuckle about a situation, and we found that it was a lot healthier to chuckle about it. And it was amazing. I remember times in that prison camp where my stomach would hurt because I was laughing so hard about something that somebody else said. We had jokes. We tell jokes, and just tapping on our walls with this secret code that we used, and we got so understanding. We got so familiar with these jokes that we decided to number them. Now there's an old joke. A joke about numbering jokes in prisons, and and the joke goes, new guy shows up in prison, and they're in the mess hall, and somebody stands up and says 45, and everybody laughs. 36, everybody knows. Well, the new guy wants to be included, and so he stands up and he says 73, and nobody laughs. And and he turns to the old timer next door and said, "Hey, how come nobody laughed at my joke?" And the old timer says, "Well, some guys can tell a joke and some guys can't." Well, that was kind of the way we were. But what was happening was, at the end of every joke, somebody would have a tagline on the joke, and it was usually a pun of some sort. And we were all fighter pilots, and pretty brash guys, and pretty quick on our feet. And it was amazing how we laughed and laughed about things that were just, and even today I try to think back to these stories, and sometimes they don't even seem very funny, but they were really funny at the time. I remember one time I had a roommate. We were sort of in and out of solitary confinement, but I had this roommate, and he's peeking through a crack in the door, and I said, "How's the weather?" He said, "Socked in." Well, it was a very bright day, and I could see, almost through the thatched roof, that there was some blue sky up there. I said, "Socked in?" He said, "Yeah, come take a look." Socked in. So I went over to the crack in the door and peeked through. Somebody had hung a dirty sock over the hole. So that was socked into him.
That is very funny. A lot of our stories came from excessive guard duty and other travesties about the weather when I was in service. One of the jokes that you mentioned was, you're being told taken away in a blindfold and cuffs and all of this, and you're hurt and wounded and bleeding, and you tell Gary, who was riding with you in the plane when it was shot down and parachuted. You say something to the effect of, "Hey, these guys are serious behind in blindfolding technology." I mean, that's hilarious. And then I'd like to go to the book. This book that you've written, your autobiography, I'm No Hero, is just fascinating. I encourage anyone that's listening or tuning in to get a copy. In fact, I'll be your liaison. I'll get you a copy if you'd like the book. Just mention it to me. But I want to read from a part here. You said, and I go to the book here. One miserably hot afternoon in the summer of 1967, my conversation with Kay, who was your roommate at the time, was disrupted by a lilting song originating from outside our cell wall. The voice was tender and beautiful. I knew that a bath area was only a short distance from our wall, and not having seen a female for a long time, I sprang to the window. My hopes were encouraged as the sweet fragrance drifted into our stale cell. Although the crack in the wood was at such a poor angle, I could not see the bath area well. I peeped anyway. A pair of dainty feet stepped into view. "Hey," I whispered to my mate, "come here." Both of us now had our eyes glued to cracks, muttering, come on, to ourselves as the feet moved back and forth. A small, shapely hand placed a pink bar of scented soap on the ledge. Come on, we gasped. It was too much. I thought of all those teasing, neon down camera angles of the 1960s movies, and in color, bright red bikini panties fell to her feet. The siren song continued. We breathed harder. Closer, closer. She came closer. Her knees, her thigh, his. How utterly disgusting. Yes, there he was, a Vietnamese soldier, waltzing around wearing nothing but that perfume. That is comedy at its best, sir.
And it's true. It took us a while to understand how effeminate, at least from our point of view, how effeminate these young soldiers were. And they wore perfume and wore little pink panties, and it was something else.
That is mind-boggling here. I thought it was very, very humorous how you continuously recollected the humor in the situation, and it is very healthy and helpful. I think that's also part of the reason why such a large percentage of the POWs went on to live extraordinary lives, as opposed to normal soldiers that returned that didn't do so well. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth here in a moment. But I want to bring up a point that you made. And even before that, can I ask you a question? Did you ever have anyone developing Stockholm Syndrome?
Not really. The Stockholm Syndrome, for those who aren't familiar, is prisoners that fall in love with the captors for what reason, one reason or another. And we, two or three things were at play here. Number one, we were very diehard, devoted American combatants. We were warriors, and so it was pretty tough to change our minds. And the other part was they were very unsophisticated when it came to to basic psychology, and so they tried to brainwash us the way they were brainwashing their own people, and they could do it pretty well. Their own people, they'd have these big speakers that would blare out the party line, and in fact, they moved us around to different camps and different cells, and before we'd get rice and water, they would put a speaker in our cell, because they thought that if they could blare the party line on a daily basis to us, that we would come around and see their point of view and their way of life. And in fact, their president, Ho Chi Minh, said from the very beginning that he was going to take all the American prisoners and re-educate us and send us back to America as good communists. That's what he was trying to do. But he was doing it in such a way that was actually so simplistic and even humorous. We'd get a big laugh lots of times out of their attempt to brainwash us with just phenomenal kinds of things. I mean, out of sight kind of stuff that they would come up with. They would, tell us how unpopular the war was, back in the United States, and that 300,000 students were marching at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. The whole population of the town wasn't 300,000 people. So, so I never knew of anybody who had the Stockholm syndrome, because I guess our level of sophistication was so different. Now, having said all that, I have to say that in a lot of ways they had more natural intelligence than we did. They were pretty much right out of the jungle. In a lot of ways, they could outthink us, just from an animalistic point of view. Remember, when any of their soldiers would get into trouble, maybe one of us would take a punch at one of the soldiers of the guards, without any verbal communication at all. These other guards from around the camp would just start walking, sometimes running toward the problem. They could sense things that we couldn't sense. And so, they had a lot of internal intelligence, but not very much sophistication in the ways of trying to convince us that we were supposed to go over to their side.
I recognize that a bit, and I thought about that. These are, even though it's the Hanoi Hilton, they're still guards, and their prisoners are not only college graduates, the great majority, but Naval Academy graduates and some of the smartest men in the world, really. Young, athletic, sophisticated, and you had a esprit de corps. So I was hopeful that Stockholm syndrome didn't creep in because of your unity, because of the leadership, because of the things that that Stockdale and the other leaders had kind of created, along with yourself, that were in the camp.
That's a very good point, and it truly was the leadership that brought us back happier and healthier mentally and physically than had we not been shot down. It's a phenomenal story that of all the Vietnam veterans, nearly a third have PTSD. In fact, 30.6%, as a study was done 3 or 4 years ago. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have PTSD. And the folks that know a lot more about this than I do, the psychiatrists and psychologists and people that study these things, believe that it was because of our leadership. They are guys like Jim Stockdale and Jeremiah Denton and John McCain. These guys turned the whole thing around. They changed the focus. They would not let us whine. They said, "Wait a minute, we're warriors. We're not on the defensive here. We're on the offensive." And it was kind of hard to imagine that at first, but it brought the unity of that team of guys that couldn't see each other or talk to each other or discipline each other. Or it brought the unity that gave us the strength, to not just to combat the enemy, but to survive and even thrive through a difficult situation.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful testament to leadership as a philosophy, as well as to the the American fighting man's spirit. You tend to oftentimes look at the inverse of what people would think. For instance, PTSD, you mentioned, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, you guys coined a phrase called post-traumatic growth. And maybe Nietzsche helped out a bit with that, but the experience of allowing what didn't kill you to make you stronger. One of the quotes that you laid down was, "Never forget, we only get so many struggles in life, and it's a terrible thing to waste any of them."
That's very true.
Marvelous words, Captain Plum. How'd you come up with that in such dire situations?
It wasn't because of the thought process, it just actually evolved. I remember maybe 3 or 4 months when I was into the prison camp, and we were tapping on the wall and passing around Bible verses and patriotic quotes and poems and anything to keep our minds active. And one of the quotes that I got was this. It said, "Acid does more harm in the vessel it's stored than on the subject it's poured." And what that meant to me was that, yes, I can have all this anger and bitterness and vitriol within my body, and it's not hurting the enemy at all. It's hurting me. And I thought to myself, I think we're going to live through this. But if I die, they're going to have to work for it. I'm not going to kill myself, with all this negative juice that's going through me. And so I pledged at that moment to keep things on the positive and to take this challenge and make something from it. And I kind of knew at the time that there would be some value in the pain. And of course, that's, one of the things that I say that I talk about today, in my talks is, hey, in every adversity in life, regardless of what, there's some kind of an opportunity in there. And the key, the key is it's a puzzle, the key is to solve this puzzle. Where is the opportunity within this challenge? And so, yes, so we came back and we're sort of poster boys for this PTG, and it's gaining popularity. In fact, there's a bill in Congress now to ask the VA hospitals to come up with this PTG program, because lots of times they're treating what they call this disorder or this disease, not really realizing that adversity really can be of value if it's treated properly. And so I'm involved in several veterans groups. Probably the one that I'm most involved in is called Boulder Crest, and it's kind of a camp where guys with PTSD will come there and we turn them around, and it's very successful, just because we really believe that there can be growth through stress.
Yeah, there's I've heard the phrase distress versus use stress, and actually making some good use out of that stress. You mentioned your keynote presentations, and I think that's really where a lot of the audience members, whether they're national sales member or leaders, or they're heads of broker dealers, or even if they're going to sponsor an event, they can call on you to deliver some of these terrific presentations. You have many to choose from. In fact, I'll mention the website later, but I'll do it now. It's charlieplumb.com. Folks can go in there and kind of check out all of your work. But one in particular I want to ask you about, though, is the one on teamwork. And you mentioned that in a world where downsizing forces us to do more with less, packing parachutes can mean the difference in survival, yours and your teams. And before I turn the mic over to you, one of the quotes you had was that you marveled in how the military teams can function without talking to each other. They have the ability to do that. And it's not through osmosis, it's through training and communication. How can a sales team develop this packing parachutes mentality and the streamline or the ability to communicate without having to literally talk to each other about every situation?
Well, let me tell you where that phrase came from. Several years after I came home from Vietnam, I was in a restaurant in Kansas City. And a couple of tables over, a guy kept looking at me. I didn't recognize this gent, but he stood up and he came over to our table. And with a very serious look on his face, he pointed at me. He said, "You're Captain Plum." And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm Captain Plum." He said, "But you're that guy. You flew jet fighters in Vietnam. You're a fighter pilot." He said, "Part of that Top Gun outfit, and you're on the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. You were shot down. You parachuted in enemy hands, and you spent nearly 6 years as a prisoner of war." I was somewhat dumbfounded. Here's this guy is telling me my life history. I said, "How in the world did you know all that?" He said, "I'm the guy that packed your parachute."
Oh, my.
Well, it was, best I could do was stagger to my feet and then reach out a very grateful hand of thanks. He came up with just the proper words. He said, he grabbed my hand, he pumped my arm, and he said, "I guess it worked." So we had a tradition in the military. When you use a parachute, you go find the guy that packed it and buy him a drink. Well, of course, I was in no position to find the guy, and by the time I returned from the prison camp, he'd gone his way and I'd gone mine, and I couldn't go back through the records and find the guy. And so I bought him a drink. In fact, I bought him several drinks that night, and we didn't make it to the event that we were supposed to be going to. But his point, he was a very humble guy. His point was this. He said, "I'm not the only one that packed your parachute." He said, "Yeah, I did the physical job. I put the panels in there for so that you'd have a safe descent. But oh, by the way, what about your emotional parachute? What about your spiritual parachute? What about who packed those things for you and gave you that resilience that you had to have to endure those 6 years?" And so it made me think, yeah, it was the coaches. It was mom. It taught me a lot about forgiveness. And my dad taught me a lot about discipline and the freedom that you can have through discipline. And it was, brothers and sisters and my wife and all of the people who had touched me had packed my parachute. So in building a team, I think what you have to do is be the servant leader. I think you have to pack those parachutes. You have to give of yourself, asking nothing in return. Because see, parachute packing it's not a trade. It's not hey, I'm going to do this for you if you'll do that for me. And it's a gift. It's unconditional. And over the years, and I've talked to a number of wholesalers and financial planners, and I've done a series of presentations to Merrill Lynch and Van Kampen Funds and Franklin. And in every case, I find that the successful teams are the ones that care about each other and care about the client. And if you can apply that, if you can actually give without asking anything in return, magical things happen. People come around to your way of thinking just because you care about them. And it's the old adage, you don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that's very true in the finance industry, is that until that prospective client knows that you care about their financial well-being, it's tough to ever get through to them, just because you got the big office and the corner office, and you're the big guy on the block. You have to show them that you care about who they are and where they're going. So that's the whole idea of parachute packing. Now, the other thing about a team, I believe, is you have to have a purpose. There has to be a focus to what the team does. And I found that in the prison camp, is that we were fighter pilots, but boy, having been shot down, that was the worst thing could possibly happen to you. And we felt very depressed, almost suicidal depressed, because we'd given up. We were fighter pilots. Fighter pilots are not supposed to give up. That's not in our DNA. That's not our training. And we felt guilty. How in the world can I ever go back to my squadron mates, my other pilots that weren't shot down, and tell them I failed in my mission? And so when we got in the prison camp, our leaders there, best leaders I've ever seen, as a matter of fact, turned this whole idea around. Wait, we're not victims here. Nobody was as strong as they wanted to be. That, oh, by the way, we still have a war to fight, and we will fight until our last breath, to make this thing work. And so the team was set up, centered around this purpose. And I see this in companies all the time, is that companies that have a mission statement, that have a vision of where they're going, that have a stated values that they're centered around. That's the way you build teams, is around these things that you can't necessarily measure, and sometimes you can't even define what it takes to build this team. But if you can really care about the other members on your team, pack those parachutes. And then if you can, come up with this anchor, this purpose, this reason for being, that I see those teams are the most effective in all industries.
Wow, that was awesome. That team mentality and fighting for the man, for the person to the right and to the left of you is such a universal grounding bedrock cornerstone of success. The North Vietnamese tried to trick you guys, and they tried to offer you safe passage. Hey, if you sign this thing, whatever, then you can go home. And I can only imagine, the temptation to free yourself from this pain, from this agony, just by doing this simple act. However, you guys would not do it. And, John McCain was made famous for this. And the reason why you didn't do it, though, was because and in fact, you actually witnessed it. The beatings that the men that you left behind had to take were so horrific that you wouldn't do that to them. You would rather stay there and be a part of the team, as opposed to take your passage home the easy way out and leave your brothers and sisters to pay the price for that. I think sales teams can do the same thing. And instead of taking the shortcut, instead of doing things that are, not in the best interest of the team, if they simply think about what the impact will be on others, that can help guide their behavior or guide their actions, and really write the course. You guys did have a mantra, and the mantra, which I think is very succinct, very awesome, was leave with honor. Leave
That's
with
right.
honor. And here's the irony that I just discovered, actually. The North Vietnamese, their accents were a little bit different, and their word for live was leave. So how ironic is it that leave with honor is actually the way that the North Vietnamese might have said live with honor?
Uh-huh. That is I never thought about that, but that's very ironic. That was something that Stockdale came up with. And in fact, we just commissioned a destroyer named USS Stockdale. And it's a guided missile destroyer. In fact, I had the great pleasure of riding that ship with my wife and one of my sons. As a matter of fact, from San Diego up to Port Hueneme, where we commissioned this ship, and I got to speak to the crew, because they all wanted to know about Stockdale, and I served as his communications officer for a couple of years, and so I knew what was going on, and what a wonderful guy he was, and what a leader, and what an intuitive kind of a guy to be able. I mean, and figure this out. Let's say your boss comes in and says, "Hey, I got a job for you to do. I'm going to send you to a desert island with 200 guys, and I want you to accomplish this mission. And oh, by the way, you can't talk to them. You can't discipline them. You can't give them a raise. You can't give them a bonus. You can't give them leave. You can't see them. So you go to this desert island and accomplish this mission." And that's exactly the leadership challenge that these guys had in the prison camp. So they couldn't see us. They couldn't discipline us. They couldn't do anything. And so they had to approach this thing that we're talking about. They had to care for us. They had to model for us the way. And the leaders, these guys were beat up far more than us junior guys, because the enemy knew that they were trying to organize. And so they'd beat these guys up, and these guys would take the beatings and just jump right back in leadership positions. And so, and then to develop this purpose, that yes, we were warriors and we weren't on the defensive, and no whining in the prison camp. That was kind of amazing that they turned this whole thing around. And I believe the same thing is true, in corporate America and in financial institutions, is that, yeah, sure, we got a job to do, and sure, we're trying to make a living, and sure, we're trying to make a return on our investment, whatever it might be. But by the way, to put a team together and to really achieve far more than the sum of all of our parts. That we are better together because we do have leadership, and we do have unity, and we do have a purpose and a vision and a set of standards, that we live by, and that's what made it work. It was just almost magical the way that plays out when you apply the basics.
Yeah, I love it. And I've had the good fortune of being able to have leaders that could do that. And then also to see many that, were promoted beyond their position.
Yeah, we've seen that.
I appreciate your time today, and I want to definitely streamline as much as we can, but I'm really enjoying our talk here. One of your more popular, and I guess maybe impactful to me, presentations is about these mental prisons. And you say that we all get into our own mental prisons where, we're prisons of our fear of inadequacy. We are prisoners of our fear of failure and of our failure. Excuse me, I'm just butchering this terribly. We're prisoners of our fear of inadequacy, our fear of failure, and our fear of success. And you talk about a few different concepts on there: blaming others for your problems, how you react to your surroundings, believing that there's a value in adversity. In one in particular I really appreciate is the philosophy that if someone's doing something that it offends you, that it's actually your problem. Can you address this idea of mental prisons that we put ourselves into?
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of use the metaphor that the first cell that I was in was 8 feet long and 8 feet wide. And I am convinced that you can be in more of a prison with the 8 inches between your ears than the 8 feet between those cell walls. And I found that to be true in the prison camp and in everyday life. We restrict ourselves. It's not intentional, obviously. In fact, it's almost human nature. When we fall short, we start blaming everybody else for the problems and feeling sorry for ourselves and deny that we have any control of our destiny. And it's debilitating. It's destructive to think that you don't have any control, because the very basis of life, if you have a pulse, if you can fog a mirror, you have a choice. You can choose a smile or a frown. You can choose happiness or sadness. You can choose profit or loss. You can choose health or sickness. But you can also choose to give away the choice. How do you give away your choice? Blame somebody else. Now it's their choice. Feel sorry for yourself. You go into this mentality, that I've been offended. I'd like to strike that word from the dictionary. That to be offended. Well, the only way to be offended is to accept what somebody else is doing to you or saying about you. You have to accept that in order to be offended, and that's kind of hard. Wait a minute. But it's just normal human response. When somebody offends you, to respond to that. No, it really isn't. When somebody offends you, if you can really think that, hey, and the irony of this whole thing is that in an awful lot of cases, when you think somebody's offended you, if you get down to the basic brass tacks of it all, and you communicate with that person, you find out now, they didn't mean it that way, or you misunderstood what they said, or, it was pointed towards another direction. And so how many times, do we, driving down the road, somebody cuts you off, and you honk your horn and you wave your fist and you yell some obscenity toward that person, and that person just drives on off. They may not even know that they cut you off, and yet for the next 45 minutes, you got higher blood pressure. You got thoughts going through your mind. How can I get back at that guy? And so many times when we say, hey, that guy offended me, well, it's the other way around. You have to accept that offense in order for that connection to really make it. And so if you have that ability, then you also have the ability to deny that offense and get on with your life and keep your blood pressure down and live longer and happier, because because you made that choice.
Yeah, those are words to live by. I appreciate it, and yeah, I apologize for all of the fist raging that I've done. You know, being in Detroit, we don't.
Me too. Hey, I still do that. I preach. I preach a good story, but I find myself in it, and then I pull up my bootstrap. Wait a minute. You have told 5,000 audiences in the last 45 years that it's going to be their choice. Now you're doing this. How can I ever stand up in front of another audience and tell them what works when I am falling into this trap? So, it happens to us all.
That's funny.
But I live my life trying my best, to live up to that mantra, that philosophy.
Another decorated Vietnam veteran, he was an infantry company commander, and his name is John Rhodes Jr. Goes by Dr. John Rhodes. He's a mentor of mine, and he always has reminded me and all of his other mentees that that life is about progress, not perfection.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is appropriate at this point.
That's a good one, and that's very true.
So you've made a great career, 45 years or so. The book first came out in 1973. You've toured, you've spoken to 5,000 plus audiences, inspired millions of people, and continue to do so. What does the next 5, 10, 20 years for Captain Plum look like?
Well, I'm going to continue to do what I do and try to do it better every time. I am continually developing things. I'm developing a video series now based around values and visions, and what I do, I've done this now for about 5 years. I've got several clients that I do a keynote address, and they pick up on my philosophy of life, and they want to know more about it. And so I design the video series around their values and their vision. And so I have a lot of fun with that because I'm kind of an action junkie, and I fly, of course, and I fly in formation, and I fly aerobatics, and then I get on my mountain bike and go up and get bloody in the hills around my house here. And I sail, have 2 sailboats, as a matter of fact, and then our family vacation is sailing big boats down in the Caribbean. And so I draw metaphors from tying knots, for instance. I think that one of the basics of learning to sail is tying a knot in the end of a line. And what about that knot? Well, it has to have integrity. And it's not just one knot on that boat. If one knot goes wrong, all the rest of them can be tied properly and by well-meaning people. But one knot loses its integrity, and you're going to get somebody hurt. You may even lose the boat. And so I talk about integrity in these videos, and how it's not just one time that you have to be honest and truthful and open and transparent. It's all the time. It's every knot on the boat has to be tied with integrity. So that's kind of what I'm doing, and going into different areas. Of course, I continue to work for veterans. I continue to talk to schools. Now, this is a challenge, because these school kids now are 2 and 3 generations away from Charlie Plumb, and their music is different, their humor is different, their language is different, their mores and folkways and all different from me. How in the world do I get into the hearts and minds of these kids? And so it continues to be a challenge for me to try to impart from my experience some principles and some wisdom to these kids who for the most part know nothing about the Vietnam War or much of any history, as a matter of fact, and so it's a challenge to try to bring them up to speed and tell them what I think is really important in life.
Well, the principles are timeless. However, my military service was, as my oldest daughter, Rachel, would say, back in the 1900s as well. So I continue to try to pour into them, and not to necessarily try to use their language to communicate with them, but to expose them to an ancient language, the one of integrity, the one of honor, and the one of community. So I continue to go arm in arm with you in that endeavor.
That's a very good point. I spoke last week in Milledgeville, Georgia, and very few people have ever heard of Milledgeville. There's a great history there, and there's a school there. It's called Georgia Military College, and so I talked to about 1,000 cadets in this school last week, and they were sixth grade through sophomores in college, so it had quite a span of age group. And that's why I tried to identify with them. I told them, hey, you and I are a lot different, but there's one commonality that you and I have. There's a baseline to who you are and who I am. Because at age 17, I stood on the same bricks that you did in this drill field, and I raised my hand and I pledged to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and you have too. Now let's talk about that commitment. And so that sort of got their attention anyway for the next few minutes.
Giving me chills here. That's awesome.
Yeah, then they were very receptive to to what I had to say. But it is a challenge, and but one of the things is very important.
Well, I'll also echo and maybe offer for your consideration that when your group was coming up and you guys came out with this thing called rock and roll, it was going to ruin the world, So
yeah, no. My dad said, he really seriously thought that rock and roll, and Elvis and shaking his hips and all of the disgusting direction that we were going in life. So somewhat generational, I think.
Indeed. Speaking of that, I'd like to transition here, and we're coming up to the home plate. I have two signature questions, which I hope you'll find amusing and interesting. I'd like to ask you.
Okay.
And the first one is, Captain Plum, what advice? Let me just phrase it this way. Let's say that you pick up the telephone, and on the other end of the line is this polished, spit-shined, just graduated from the academy, Charlie Plumb. Was that make you like 22 years old, 23 years old?
Yep.
And so young Charlie Plumb answers the phone, and you have 5 minutes. What advice would you give your younger self?
Good question. One of the first things I think I would tell myself is, hey, keep track of those folks that are meaningful in your life. Because you and I, and especially from our military career, have run into a number of people that are really valuable to us, and yet I never kept track of a lot of those guys. I mean, yeah, there are a few of them that I see once in a while, but there are an awful lot of them that I'd like to communicate with, because in fact, I'd like to tell them thanks. I'd like to hook up with these guys, and it can be done today. It was more difficult, when I was growing up and going through the military, because you had to do it in pencil and paper and manual typewriters. And today, you can get online and find these folks. But I think that would be one thing I would tell myself is to stay close to the people that are meaningful to you. I think I would tell myself to read more. I wouldn't change very many things in my life if I had to go back and live it again. But there's so much to be learned through biographies of other people, and so I think that would be one of the things that I would recommend to my 21-year-old self. I guess I was 21 when I graduated from Annapolis. And, I would say, get into the books, find out how other people lived, and even, back through history, find heroes that lived 300 and 400 and 500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. Find the Greeks, and study those guys, because, as you say, so much of so much of philosophy today is forever. It's enduring. It started long time ago, and it will continue for a long time after you and I have gone. And if you can tap into those baseline philosophical tenets of the heroes of the past through reading, through investigation, that's one of the things that I would say to myself. I think being honest with yourself and with everybody else. But sometimes I think we talk ourselves into believing things that we know really aren't true. Now, I'm a positive thinker, and I believe in thinking, that the glass is half full, not half empty. That's for sure. But sometimes I think we can positively think ourselves out of reality. And that was another thing that Jim Stockdale did for us, was he said, we're hurting, we have a challenge here, and we can define this challenge, and we know pretty much what it is, and we know pretty much it's painful. But, oh, by the way, having said that, we truly feel that we can emerge from this prison camp better, physically and mentally and emotionally, emerge better than when we came in. And so, I believe in reality, searching for the truth, and not allowing yourself to kid yourself into thinking that something is not really true.
Terrific. That's got to be one of the best answers that any guest has given. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks.
Second question, and this is a little more fun, but it can be very serious. Captain Plum, if you could choose any superpower to have, which one would you choose, and what would you do with it?
Oh boy. Well, I don't know. Superman sure had some interesting abilities, to fly, with his cape, jump tall buildings in a single bound, and and see through things. That would be a pretty nice superpower as well. So yeah, I think that would be my guy. Spider-Man, that always looked kind of painful for me to stretch out, that far. But Superman flying through the air would be my superpower.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Captain Plum, sir, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for your many years of inspiration and education that you deliver with your presentations, and your very positive and helpful advice. We all appreciate you and your work, and we wish you much fortune and success both now and in the future. And if I can go back to the book one last time, final quote from the book that I really enjoyed was this, and I go to the book: "My nation is a skinny kid who climbs on his bike before dawn to sling newspapers. My country is a librarian who sits behind glasses with pencil and hair and is quick to find answers to my question. My homeland is a truck driver who smiles down from his cab and signals me through the intersection. My America is a personal friend, and I am proud to serve her." Captain Plum, sir, thank you for your service, and bravo Zulu.
Hey, using Navy terms.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike. You're awesome.
I appreciate you saying that more than you know. If you'd like to contact Captain Plum, he's on LinkedIn, of course. They're virtually everywhere on the internet. His website is charlieplumb.com. You can contact him for speaking engagements. He will surely be an awesome presenter for any team or audience. As we say on the Awesome Wholesaler Experience podcast, it's about the journey. And Captain Plum, we wish you well on yours. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. And if you haven't done it already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and that little notifications bell, too, so you'll be notified every time that we release a new episode. Awesome ratings and reviews are never expected, but always appreciated. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for supporting the show. And thanks for being awesome. Good night, everybody.